Welcome to the Embodiment Matters podcast with me, Erin Giesemann-Rabke, and my beloved Carl Rabke. We don't have the luxury of living in ordinary times, but rather we live in extraordinary ones where the way we live in the next decade will make a huge difference in the future of life on planet Earth. We aspire in this tapestry of rich conversations drawn from a variety of wise perspectives to share resources to help you embody the wisdom, compassion, and skillful actions that are needed during these times. You can find out more about our classes and sign up for our newsletter at embodimentmatters.com. You can also become a supporting member of our podcast with a small monthly donation. Look for Embodiment Matters at patreon.com.
Welcome, listener friends. I am so excited to share with you this conversation I had with John Wolfstone. So John is a wilderness rites of passage guide, ritualist, community consultant, transmedia storyteller, and he describes himself as being on a mission to reclamate adult initiation rites of passage and holding space for the great grief of our times. John designs and facilitates rituals of transformation in service to regulating the personal and collective nervous systems back into belonging with the earth. John is apprenticed in numerous indigenous and ancestral ritual healing lineages during his own decade-long initiation quest and bows in reverence to his many teachers, mentors, guides, and elders. John is also one of the co-founders of the School of Mythopoetics and is leading a year-long adult initiation program through that school. And I first met John, we were in a grief ritual facilitation training program with Francis Weller, and I just had a great connection with him, and we've been following similar threads. And so we were really excited to dive into this topic of initiation and what it really means to be an adult in this world and the challenges that many of us face without having these kind of cultural foundations of initiations and rites of passage and how to work with that. So we hit on lots of beautiful topics, the challenges when initiations aren't there, how to kind of put together our own way and to have a kind of ritual initiatory lens to look at life and the challenges of being thrust into initiatory process unwillingly, and also what it means, what are some of the markings of someone who has become an adult, and this traditional understanding that adults don't just happen from being on this planet for a long time, but it's a growing of adults, and how important community and elders are for this process. So you can find out more about John on his website, johnwolfstone.com, and also through the School of Mythopoetics.com. So I hope you enjoy the conversation, and thank you for listening. So welcome, John. It is so good to be with you today. So I'd love to start this conversation with a topic that I know is dear to both of us. But if you were to describe what initiation is to maybe like a 12-year-old or someone who's not familiar, what's your sense of this word that points to so much?
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Just feeling my body, feeling my breath. Sometimes when something has so much gravity, I feel the call to slow down.
Yeah.
Really make sure I'm speaking from deep in my body, from my heart. I mean, initiation in the context that I typically use it in, because that term in general, I think initiation, I think it really begs the question, initiation into what?
Mm-hmm.
And so in general, it's often typically some sort of rite of passage into a next level of something. Yeah. But in the work that I do, and in the way that I speak about it, I really speak about it in the context of adulthood, which is both a cultural and a psychological place or function to be initiated into. And so I'd start by saying, being a human being, as far as I understand, from looking at cultures around the world, some indigenous, some ancestral, many that still exist and practice more intact cultural ways now, that these cultures are really centered around various rites of passage of human beings moving from one life stage developmentally to the next. And, and a very common one, like maybe the most obvious one, is the transition from being a kid to being an adolescent with puberty, because there is this biological rite of passage that happens, right?
Right.
It's not like it's not lost on anybody that there's like, wow, there's a initiation of sorts that happens at that like age. And the adulthood initiation rite of passage or portal, in many ways, what I've seen in my work is one of the most important missing links of like the cultural picture that many of us are working to remember and reconnect with and regenerate, all these wonderful rewords. Because in many ways, many traditional cultures centered around this initiation into adulthood as like a fundamental facet that kept their culture regenerative. Because they recognized that it wasn't enough just to get older from 13 on, and that was a certain phase of being a like adolescent, being a teenager. As you have kids, I think maybe one's almost a teenager. I've worked with teenagers for a long time. What a this wild, place to be. And the requirements culturally and the psychology of somebody's 15 is very different from somebody's 25.
Right.
And most cultures would recognize this and really recognize the need. And what just emerged was these initiation rites that helped individuals through a psycho-spiritual process of maturation.
Yeah.
Where through a series of like trials and mentorship, and often time away from the like society to really be a initiate, people would go through a very strong transformational, often death and rebirth process, where they would psychologically mature and culturally step into a new state of being, of really membership with their group or village, and really in a place where they no longer were on the like take as a young person, but they were in a role of service and really a cosmology of service.
Yeah. I love that term, cosmology of service.
Yeah. So I don't really know if that's the like simple way I would share it with a 12-year-old, but that's how it came out.
Yeah, no, I think it's great. Well, I think it points to that notion that has been shared by so many cultures on this planet, that it's not an automatic to get to adulthood, and certainly not to elderhood, just by the amount of years that you've spent, and that it takes tempering. And in kind of many modern, especially modern Western culture, we've lost that sense. And I love the term from Robert Bly with that book of A Sibling Society, that there's this kind of adolescent me first mentality that then goes into the beyond 16, into the 20s and into the 40s and into the 60s, and oftentimes right to the deathbed, without really ripening into that sense of community, of serving in some way.
Right. And I think that what's coming to mind is this, in some ways, like a map of the human being or the human psyche, which is interesting because the word psyche in Greek actually means soul. That so much of this work is around like going through puberty, we get to a place psychologically of developing this ego, this personality that can relate to the world, which is totally necessary. And yet we kind of know that there's a problem just living from an ego-based place. But really what we're kind of lacking, I see in mass culture, there's a lot of kind of the Buddhist, like, or I think people attribute it to Buddhism, but I don't think it actually is a Buddhist belief that you need to like kill your ego or get rid of the ego. And that actually isn't, I think, what any of this is. But there is a place of maturation through the adulthood initiatory rite of passage where we transition our center of gravity from the ego to really the soul.
Mm-hmm.
The soul being living from the deepest, most essential point in us that came on this planet to give like very particular gifts to the world, and only a way that we or our souls could give them. And a big part of that initiation was really going through like a liminal process where one could really leave the like regular consciousness of daily life behind and access the deeper liminal soul terrain to discover like, wow, what is my soul? What am I actually here to do? Because most intact cultural people knew that, oh, the culture stays healthy when people are giving their deepest soul gifts and living from that soul-oriented place.
Yeah. I think that's all right. Lots of threads to follow here, but that's one of the things that I see is missing when we don't have cultural initiations, is that people don't have a chance to experience who they are in their uniqueness and what kind of medicine they carry for the world. So we miss out on that because there's such a mass culture. You get the same education as other people, and there's such a sense of not being blessed, like, oh, this is what I see in you uniquely. This is your gifts. This is what's coming through you, and how that gets fed.
And I think that, what you're really talking about to me is really a cultural model of mentorship, or where culture is built through like interlocking rings of mentorship.
Yeah.
And that's like fundamentally initiation is not just like people often think it's some harrowing experience, or it's like I had a near death experience, like they're like, that was quite a initiation. People speak of that way, and like that can be true, but in the deeper sense of it being really a cultural function, it actually takes having older, like elders and people older who've been through the process to anchor and guide you, because it's not just having some intense experience that takes you out of your element. It's also having the reflection and the guidance to be able to really see oneself and also see one's shadows, see the parts of oneself that need to be worked on and loved up and healed, so that one can truly know oneself in the community, in like service. So it's never just a solo endeavor in that sense.
Yeah. And I think as you describe that, like what comes is just the profound absence of initiatory process for many people in modern life. And the way that, even though there aren't many cultural supports for many people, initiatory process still happens, so that that common theme of the severance, the separation, some kind of a trial, and some sort of a welcoming back. That's one lens of these three phases, not complete, but some common elements. But whenever there's some sort of a severance, whenever there's some sort of a cancer or an accident or an illness or a divorce or something, something in the soul is like, we're in initiatory process right now. And I love how both Michael Meade and Francis Weller talk about rough initiation or suspended initiation when we get caught in that process where it doesn't actually come to any sense of completion, but we get stuck in kind of that liminal space around a trauma, around some severance where there's not community, where there's not a process, a way of taking that process to some kind of completion or to some next identification after that.
Well, yeah, there's not really a cultural form holding it, or a culture around it. And really for me, it speaks to the crisis of integration we're in as a culture. We had Martin Shaw, when we were launching the School of Mythopoetics, which is a online school that I run, he did like a talk in a support, and he was talking about that in the sense that there are these 3 stages of initiatory events, which happen throughout our lives. It's like there's so many of these moments, right? And there's like a severance from something old, this liminal phase of like trials and like being a little bit lost in it, and then the integration into something new. And that we've become really a 2-stage culture, that we're really good at the severance, like, screw that old thing. And here I am in the lost wandering for years, but where is the village to go back to? Where is the community of elders to bless us and say, you're done now. Now you are actually like, here's your like new name. Here's your like new set of roles. So I think that's why so much of the work that's called me in my own initiatory process in life is, what does it mean to really be, or maybe better said, to really go through a more official adulthood initiation, which I think is like meant to happen once amongst the various initiations that happen in life, is to really be initiated into becoming a cultural generator, somebody that knows how to build culture around all these moments. Because these moments will keep happening, and it's not about necessarily you always having the perfect setup for it, because we live in a very broken world, but it's like, can we gain the consciousness around building culture? And I feel that I carry that. Like when things happen in my life or the lives of people around me, there's just this place in me that now knows how to bring culture and containership, really, how to build a container, how to ritualize, so that isn't just some lost, floating, liminal thing forever that actually is trauma, right? How do we bring containership, bring some story, bring some people around, and really help the person like get out of that phase, actually. And that's so much of the work that we're like in, humanity as a whole has severed from whatever beautiful like Garden of Eden place we were maybe in when we were all indigenous in the like Pleistocene. The like Anthropocene is the like initiatory portal. And now it's, wow, can we build the cultural containers to land that? And a lot of gifts, happened from humanity's burgeoning self-reflective consciousness. And whoa, if we just get lost in this, we have caused a lot of harm, and we're just going to essentially kill everything versus landing into something beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think that points to this, the many levels of global initiation that we're in around COVID and the severance and the trial of that, around the deep background and kind of anticipatory grief of climate change. Like there is this shared liminal space that we are in as a planet with the human and more than human world. And I think what you're pointing to as far as the culture building element, like how do we start to grow the lens that can recognize initiatory process, where we are in it, where others are in it, and how to collect and contain and
well,
come to the next.
I think in what you're saying, I think of what one of my teachers, Stephen Jacobson, says. He talks a lot about the need for each generation to find what their spirit work is. And it's, like we're no longer in the Pax Romana of like Western civilization. Like maybe being alive in the US was like Pax Romana in like the 50s. It was like
For some.
it was yeah, for some, right? For some, but like there wasn't yet the greater the awareness was just really starting to really come in of like, oh, some shit's really like messed up. And increasingly, I think like the children, like I was still born in an age where the American dream was like pretty solid. And probably you were too. I was like, America's great.
You got last call on that one, I think.
Right. I was last call. And like I just spent a weekend with like 15 and 16-year-olds. It's part of just the work I do in the world. And we were doing counsel, this form of like talking, in with a talking piece. And they were talking about their consciousness growing up in the era of climate change and really collapse. And like the wool is not pulled over their eyes at all. These kids are woke, for lack of better words. And, the things they were talking about, they were like, we like know what the science says. Like the question we're sitting with is humanity actually going to go extinct? And what if the task of our generation is to like tend the human project down? Like, what does that mean? And I like, is full stop. Like this is the wisdom of elders coming through these 15-year-olds. And I think what it speaks to is that one, we live in initiatory times. So we just need to, as a culture, recognize that and then be like, okay, what is our spiritual work? We are not living in times of going to be increased stability. We are living in times of decreasing stability. Probably will be for my entire lifetime and yours, and maybe your children's even, who knows? But to first even digest that makes there's like a different skill set to be initiated into, And I think the bigger question that it brings up, which I think is part and parcel of what initiation culturally is and has always been about, is death. Mm-hmm. Because the biggest mystery of being alive is death, right? It is the final frontier. It is the thing that transcends and includes everything. And it is absolutely terrifying to the ego. And healthy, intact cultures knew that death essentially had to be faced in life. And that was a huge point of the adulthood initiation rite of passage, was to help individuals really like psychologically and really practically encounter death. And through that process, I think just the like over attachment of the ego being the center of focus would die in that there'd be an ego death, as they say, which doesn't mean the ego dies forever. It's just like a shedding a layer, maybe its shell, so that we could walk. Because we also know the consciousness that comes when we are aware of endings. When you're with somebody that's dying, or this is your last day in this place, it's like everything gets so precious and beautiful, and you walk with this open-hearted care. So healthy cultures knew if individuals could really go through this essentially death process in life, they could live in a way where they're really holding the preciousness of life in one of their hands with like grief and praise.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like that the basis of especially the initiation at adolescence is some kind of a contained confrontation with death that also, like, I think both Martin Prechtel and Malidoma Somé have described, like, not everyone makes it. I mean, often they do, but sometimes the intensity is that someone doesn't come back from initiation, which also makes it's hard to have that on your summer initiation program or something like that. Like, if you're really coming up against those energies of death and challenge in that way.
And that's, and I think the thing is, it's like, well, like you said, initiations happen anyways. Like, there just is kind of by design of life, the death impulse. I think what Freud called it, thanatnos, it's out there in our psychic fields, in the field of life, like lurking, and it comes for all of us at a certain moment. And essentially, initiation, as people could see, like my left hand is holding up the death impulse of life, and cultures met that with an appropriate cultural response. That's what initiation is, because actually that is the cycle of life always happening. Every day we eat, we poop, it becomes soil, becomes food. And like that death, rebirth, like right now we're at fall. This is when like Persephone has been taken into the underworld in this like death process for 6 months to then reemerge, which is like a mythic understanding of the death and rebirth that's happening every year as the wheel of the year turns, every day as the sun descends and dies and then is reborn every single morning. Like, and that circular regenerative understanding, which is in some ways, I'd say more of a like, it's not just only goddess worship, but it's like a goddess in like a more mythological, cosmological sense. Like it's really understanding the power of the goddess and not just the god head in our culture. That is just what's happening all the time in life. So it's also just to start to see the world in this more like circular way. Mm-hmm. And that's just like part of life. We live in this culture that's trying to angle us always up on some escalator.
Yeah.
And think about that. That's why the economy is right now it's like, you can't just grow infinitely. That's what cancer is. That is actually will kill the whole system. There's actually these cycles, and can we as human beings learn that in ourselves and tend those throughout life?
Yeah. I'd love to talk, just imagining listeners out there, many of whom who didn't have made it to their 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s without having some formal ritual-based initiation. And I remember when Michael Mead was talking about the lost art of mentoring, that a lot of the traditional mentoring roles that would be there of like how you become a blacksmith or how you become a medicine, that these sort of deep apprenticeships haven't been there or have been lost in modern culture, and how important it is to recognize mentoring moments, like recognize when there's an opportunity to bless or acknowledge. And I'm just thinking for people, like, I'd love to reflect a little bit on like, what are some of the marks of someone who is an adult?
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of like a basic overarching way to say it. I'd say that an adult is someone that like sources their power, their life force from within themselves through their connection to source, through their connection to like something larger than themselves. Adults know their place in the world and actualize that through service, through their like gifts. And adults are emotionally mature and take responsibility for their impact upon the world. That's the broad base.
Yeah.
More of the like details, some of the markings I think you're talking about is that I'd say one, to be an adult is to recognize oneself in a flow of cultural mentorship, meaning adults would have courted like what we sometimes call anchors, but are essentially mentors in their like life. Like one of the first thing I do with most people that I like work with, whether they're working with me one-on-one or in one of the initiatory programs that have been running now, is to find at least 2, and like ideally you're growing more 4 or 6 mentors, like 10 to 20 years older than like you, just as like a like basic guideline, which are people that you can actually activate that relationship in your life. And there's a whole process I can talk about of what that like means, but it's somebody that you regularly connect with, maybe go make them dinner or work in the yard, and you share some of like your like story, and they're tracking you and you catch some of theirs, because that's good medicine. And it's like essentially having intergenerational friendships, for lack of, to make it really simple, right? And that's like, for some people, again, you said Robert Bly, the sibling society, that's like, so to that's like unheard of. So to intentionally craft that and then to recognize one's place to offer that to younger people is a very, I'd say, adult move in the world. I'd say further step out, it's especially for people in North America, especially for people that look like you and me, I think rebuilding connection to one's ancestry and creating a sense of like belonging and also doing the work. Be like, okay, what are the wounds my ancestors carried and passed on to me? And how do I also connect to some resource from my ancestors and actually get out of this like really damaging myth of whiteness into like, okay, I'm Germanic and I'm Jewish. This is my, and is another place of like cultural fluency. I think that a adult, and there's so much work there that we could talk about in cultural rituals that go with that. I think that being an adult in this day and age means really, I mean, you could say that maybe a fundamental piece that includes a lot is you've really journeyed into your wounds. And in many ways, I like to call it mythically, this comes from Robert Bly, creating a womb for your wounds to gestate into your gifts. Like there's this common idea that your wounds are the seeds of your gift. Or I like to say the wounds are the shape of your gifts inside out.
Yeah.
And which means, looking into trauma and trauma healing and also looking into like, the work that you're doing with embodiment, which is like, I have a nervous system and it gets activated. And when it's activated, I'm like literally going back into more archaic like parts of my brain and often acting unconsciously in maybe really harmful ways to myself and others. And like kind of try to track that and integrate that and take care for like that. I don't really hang out with people honestly right now as an adult that haven't done that work or aren't doing that work because it's scary. I most of us grew up in a world of people that were having nervous system reactions they weren't aware of or attending to. And it's not, I get triggers all the time, right? But I think it's like there's fluency. And then I'd say the last big area amongst other ones is really, and I said this in the beginning, really building a relationship to like the sacred and the like more than human world, and not just like the animal world, certainly, but like the spiritual world, which can mean so many things. And at some level, so individual, it's also very cultural, but really a place of like having the humility to, this is what I actually think the 12-step program, which like, as this come in my field a lot, it's so beautiful that like the first step is like admitting I need help. And just like, okay, like we as human beings are not the center of the universe. There's a greater mystery and we can relate to it and get help from it and offer things to it. And there's like a reciprocity relational dance that is prayer and ritual and altars. And so I think that any truly initiated adult is walking that walk, and that's how they're kind of starting to weave magic, because it's not just them, they're like pulling on bigger threads.
Exactly. And that also points to that fundamental sense of belonging. Like I belong in this incarnation, in this place with these seen and unseen beings, that sense of, just like that, the gravitas of like, you can feel someone who has that sense of belonging. And I think you pointed to something really important earlier, is that fundamental shift of a consumptive presence versus a generative presence. And am I looking to accumulate resource and teachings and all these things, like that kind of spiritual materialism, or is there something that is turning the light back toward what's needing help in this world? And I think this is this edge that has so much potential right now, especially for the elders, the olders in the world, of like how much their resources and their time could be worth if it wasn't like taking vacations around, but like really turning that light back toward this time where we're actually at that precipice of being able to survive on this planet. It seems like there's such an opportunity for that, like Joanna Macy's term, the great turning.
Right. And, I think the kind of big cultural shift is, we live in a country founded on the right to the pursuit of happiness. And it's like, reality check. Happiness is built from living a life of service. That is actually, and like, actually most people, they really checked in with themselves and track their own life. They're like, oh yeah, I'm actually the most content when I'm like in a place of service. And again, that often gets a bad rap because we're so taught to work and martyr outside our boundaries. And like, it's really like warped what people think of work and service. But it's like, man, when I'm serving, I am like so fulfilled, because really deeper joy comes from like existential fulfillment.
Yeah.
And sense of purpose is from service. And then when you're matching that service with like your soul, it's like, oh, I was meant to, that place when all of my cylinders fire and I'm used, like where my like potential is being tapped. And we all hit those moments. Like I could work 20-hour days because I'm so juiced by what I'm doing. Like, and that is available in so many ways, in so many moments at every life stage. But it's that basic orientation that I'm going to be happier ultimately in these place of service than I am sitting on the beach in Cabo drinking like Mai Tais or whatever. That like, cool, that's good to like relax and take a vacay. I love going to hot springs, like necessary. Like self-care is only like self-care, I'd say, is actually a big part of being a initiated adult. But it's so that I can come back and like being the dance of the like giveaway. And it's so fulfilling.
Yeah. I love that line, the closing line of Mary Oliver's To Begin with the Sweetgrass, where she says, first love yourself, then forget it, then love the world. And that each is really necessary, that we have to have that baseline self-care, that metabolism of our wounds and our history, like, and then to let that go background and turn it back to the world. And it's not that just happens once and is over. It's always this dance of this loving oneself. But the emphasis now really needs to be on turning toward the world and what needs. And that's also the gap in the initiatory process, that if we haven't been blessed, if we don't have someone mirroring back like, hey, John, this is what I see. This is how you are in the world. This is where I see your medicine. If it doesn't get reflected back to us by our mentors or by community, then we don't know what our gifts are to meet these times.
Totally. And I think to follow that kind of map of love oneself, like forget about it, love the world. Actually, and right now we're both speaking as men, as male-bodied folks. And I was just on that call with a man in a men's initiation that I'm running or guiding right before this call. And this man was really struggling where the men are doing a like story share of their like life. And this man who so cares about like ending violence against women and like ending the patriarchy and these beautiful things was like terrified of doing this story sharing. Like, why should anybody listen to me? And like, I take like white men take up too much space. But the key like logical link missing, this is such a common thing I find with men, is they're jumping to wanting to serve the world. Actually, it's beautiful and noble, but when that self-love piece isn't there, when like essentially the world's fucked because a lot of men are in power that have zero connection to their wounded little boy inside. And actually, before we can really be of service to the world, we need to take a lot of care with like the really wounded little boy that didn't get his needs met by mother and father because we just didn't live in that kind of culture where that could happen. And that process of actually giving ourselves the attention that we need and the love and care that we need, especially for men, is like like just connecting to the like little one, as I call it, and like, wow, my little one is angry, and like creating that relationship where we can start to mother and father ourselves and our little one is like one of the biggest like revolutionary changes, I think, in this work of like men's work and the initiatory rite of passage. And it's so vulnerable because it's like, it's not about being the hero strong man. It's about being tender with oneself and learning to let that little boy cry and scream and be held and receive what he needs so that he can come whole into the world, not with a bunch of unmet shadow needs that then are sideways causing havoc, which is the world that we have. Like, that's why men do harmful, like very unintegrous things with money, sex, and power, because of deep unmet needs of their like little wounded boy. And like, I'm calling for men to come into these initiatory portals of getting support for a man. You know, Francis Weller, one of our teachers, talks a lot about, it's like, often for a man, it's learning just to like be held together and ask for like help. Like, that is a very initiatory move in our culture.
Yeah. And that seems, going back to like, what are the marks of an adult? It feels like for any gender to have discrimination, to know who's holding power, sex, money, how you respond to climate, any of those. Is it the wounded child, or is it some parenting adult that can, and how to know, like, okay, like if the child has the wheel, like we got to pull this thing over and because no good can come of this. And to learn how to give care to those undeveloped aspects, but also to really have some strong discrimination of when some child consciousness is getting behind the wheel.
Totally. I mean, this is a bit more advanced, but it's in general, it's like, hey, I start to relate with my inner parts. You know, there's a great practice called internal family systems, which is like parts work, it's called. And it's like, okay, yeah, first thing, when the little boy is up, you don't shame him or like discipline him. It's like, cool, he has a like legitimate need and needs love. And this is more advanced, but it's like in certain moments, the actually mature move is to compartmentalize that. If I'm up in front teaching, or like in a moment, say I'm like in a space full of people of color and women, it's like, hey, not the time for my little boy to get his need for attention met. So I'm going to compartmentalize that, but I'm going to come back and then I'm going to be like, hey, bud, not right now, not the time. And that's, it's like the same way you would deal with an actual child you were raising. You're like, sometimes, little guy, it's not the moment in like the mall to tell. And sometimes it happens, you know, but it's like, but later I'm really going to sit with you and give you the attention that you like need. And there's just a certain discernment that can come when we're actually in relationship. So you could say this entire arc of initiation is really about coming into relationship.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah. And I think that's also one of the challenges of living in this modern culture with nuclear families. I mean, you know, the family system is so isolated in general. And then when it comes to dealing with that transition at adolescence, like the people I know who have young teenage girls and boys, and you can't do it as a family union, that it needs more. And how for people who don't live in an intentional community or have that sort of networks, how do you seek out that kind of community? I mean, I know for our son, who also has his friend who's a year younger, like they've had initiation in their consciousness for the last 5-6 years of knowing that at a certain point there'll be some sort of a thing where they'll have a kind of vision quest or some kind of, like, it's been seeded in them, and knowing that there'll be elders that get together and support that. But for many people, that sense of community or elders holding space isn't there.
Right. And I think that it's kind of a mix. In some ways, I think it's not even seeking the right people, it's activating culture amongst it's, but it's realizing, okay, your group of friends has cultural work to like do. And for instance, say I'm like, probably some level doing this, say I'm talking to like you or some other man, say talking to a group of like fathers or a father, and he's like, my son, and like, what do I do? And I'd be like, okay, so you get a group of men that you know, maybe your friends, maybe the friends you watch, say like really were in like mass culture, like the guys you watch football with every Sunday. Like you get them together and you talk about like, you know, our sons are getting older and like there's something to be done. And then you start up, like, how are we going to activate into the culture? Maybe that means we need to start doing our own men's work to build trust amongst ourselves. And maybe we're going to court out an elder. We're all going to read this book. And we start realizing we have a cultural task together beyond just watching football, which is great. Great to do that as a basis of actually connecting. But then, so I think sometimes, because I think that this the same way it's like ritual is so inherent to being human, which is something I know that you explore and live by. It's like being a cultural carrier that does this work is just part of being human. And I think we need to learn how to activate that again. And there are resources in teachers and maps, me and you and some of our teachers being amongst them. And it's like, we don't have to go necessarily far beyond the people that are already around us or the parents of the kids at your school. But there is a moment where there's a, like being a initiated adult does mean taking some leadership. So it might be like, cool, maybe you speak up, call all the parents of your son's class in school. I don't know if he goes to school, you know, and be like, let's have a meeting because this education does this really well, but there's this other piece. And there's so much to be done. I say the other thing in this is that the original mentor is the natural world.
Yeah. Yeah.
What was coming to me is like, for all the 12-year-old and 13-year-olds I've worked with, the fundamental thing we do is build towards having them do an overnight solo fire, which is just like a deep immersion into the elements, into the natural world, into wood. And at every stage of life, these rites of passage, I think the natural world kind of becomes our like womb. And that to really be a initiated adult is to also recognize us as a like earthling. As you know, the word human in Hebrew, one of my ancestral languages, is like, or like the word earth is Adamah. And like human is like Adam, like the original man in that creation myth, Adam, Adamah, meaning like the first human was earthling of the earth, like literally. And that just that realizing like, oh, all indigenous cultures, all of their wisdom came from the natural world. They were originally mentored by the bees and the bears and the birds and the badgers and all those other great bee things and all the rest, you know, but that they're like, I don't think this work can happen outside of re-immersing ourselves in the natural world, in the like earth. I think that because culture roots into the earth, it roots into place, it roots into ecology. So I think it'd actually be enough. Like if you could just get a group of guys together with their sons around a fire, I think the rest would start to happen, maybe very slowly, maybe with lots of fits and starts, but that's a good like recipe for something cultural to happen.
Yeah, I agree. And just it's as you were talking, just how many languages have the word for body as clay or mud, or you know, some that we're earth stuff, and that with these initiatory rhythms and this ritual intelligence, that it really is, it's so much closer than most people recognize, you know, even if you've lived in a way that's far away from that for much of your life. When you get a taste of it, in my experience, most people sense it as a kind of remembering, or more of like, oh yeah, like I know how to do this. I know how to be in this way. There just haven't been contexts that support it.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I don't know, you learn to ride a bike. I haven't ridden a bike, I don't know, in like 2 years, just because I live in the country and it's not the great bike. I get on a bike, I know how to ride a bike. And It's like, I think part of the initiation as a species is this like myopia that we're so modern and we're so disconnected. And I want to call bullshit. 99% of our ancestors lived in an earthbound, connected, culturally rooted thing. And actually, it's just daring to get back on that bike and you start getting around a fire and you start talking about these things. And yes, there is a memory in our blood, in our cells, in the earth that we are not that disconnected. We are not that far from remembering our indigenous, ancestrally connected roots. And it doesn't, like, it's great that we have these teachers. It's great. Actually, I think that memory field is available. And there's a way that in our culture, we actually, from sometimes a very disempowered place, get over dependent or like codependent with teachers and schools of thought and theories. And it's like, I've seen the great work happen just of people in nature, and that same thing happens. The same, because it isn't just talking about, it's going and doing it. So I want to bless us to like trust that like it's still in us. These like fundamental cultural ways of being that are connected, or even if you've never made a fire, if you go out there and try, you will learn eventually from your like memory. Just keep doing it.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, I mean, it's beautiful to see too that fundamental teacher of the natural world that is what is needing so much care right now. It's like the teacher is desperately calling us to be taught.
And it also doesn't need, it's the same thing, it's easy to avoid doing any of this through the romanticization of both nature and culture. It's like, well, if only I lived in like Alaska with the archetypal wilderness, or only I lived in an eco village. And it's like, like go outside. If there's sunshine, wind, and like maybe a bird or a tree, like the imprint of nature is fully there. Yeah, maybe you have to listen a little deeper, but sometimes it's actually like easier than like in the wild where you're just like overwhelmed by it because you haven't lived there actually. And same thing, like, cool if you live in this great, but I find working with kids, it's amazing to work with kids that have been homeschooled and like grew up in the woods. And it's also amazing to work with kids that are just like from the streets or from the hood. And like, sure, there's some layers of culture that like take some time to unpeel, but right under like beneath that, they're totally there as like wild little humans waiting to step into like culture. And so I just want to like, I think part of the trauma we're carrying as a people is like trying to look so far and go on these epic things outside of ourselves to find what we need. And I think that at this point, the more initiated move is to really like look close in. And even if you live in like whatever, I'm speaking from us probably both being semi-liberal, like even if you live in like Trump country, it's like, man, those people are humans with the same hearts and blood and skin and bone. And like, they're waiting to be called up to like connect to you and the world. Like do it with them because they are your neighbors. Yeah. That's going to be better than trying to reach so far. And that's what the world really like needs, is us to trust where we're at and pull people in. It's not to not have boundaries, or there's not good medicine in teachers and teachings. And like, and that's why I say part of the impetus for this podcast with you and me was like, I'm doing this program in the School of Poetics, which is a adulthood initiation ritual apprenticeship. It's a mouthful, really, which is essentially a year-long container to go through a culturally guided rite of passage into adulthood. But the work we meet online, which is beautiful, but we're doing the work in our local areas. Everyone's doing that in Germany, in England, in France, in the States, in Canada, in Australia, with people from all over the world. And we're like a support group and like a study group and like a catchment zone to integrate and share stories and learn. But we're really doing the work locally. Yeah. And that's the important thing. And that's cool. We like live in this modern world where we can do both, but we have to integrate it locally to really make it matter.
Yeah. I think that's it's a unique gift and challenge of our times that we can do elements of culture building and being in community online. And there is something that I think will also be more necessary as we move down to further challenges that will likely be coming around, like knowing who your neighbors are and who's growing what food, and that like very embodied place-based, the people who are actually around you rather than some concept of an ideal community. That feels really essential.
And that's where I also want to say, it's like at like one level, I feel like getting initiated is like stepping into like the like mystery school, and it's the most esoteric thing into the mysteries of life, and like that's true, and it's like shamanic and all these other bright like glittery words. And I think of like, if my neighbors were like breadbasket Christian people, there's like a whole nother language set, and in that culture, same thing, when they're like, it's just like becoming a good man, or like there's so many ways to speak about it where it's like not as, and it's like basic. It's like, do you neighbor value like people that are like respectful and like from the heart and like give and like do a community, it's like, yeah, most actually humans value these same things. It's not some like far out, really like fringe cultural thing. So I think it's like, how do we learn to actually also speak in the ways that the others around us, and that's what it is. To be a initiated adult is not necessarily to be out way on the fringe the rest of your life. It's actually become a bridge builder and move back towards the center and really become more inclusive, because we're going to need all of us to like move through what we're in as a species. So it's like, actually, like what I've really learned from my best teachers is how to really bridge build.
Right. Yeah. And almost bridge build from the life we're in, from like where we are and what we're doing, rather than like reimagining something. I like that kind of just gritty, normal human life, but opening up to that connection.
Yeah. Like, I don't want to like judge or claim there's some, I'm thinking now about friends I know that like moved to Costa Rica. They're like, fuck it, I'm just going to go to Costa Rica and like live in some eco village, and like, okay. And like, that's your path. Cool. And I find a lot of like respect and like oomph in my heart for the people that are like sticking it out in Salt Lake City or like, wherever they are, and building the like community and doing this work, because everywhere like needs it. And often it's more like fulfilling in these places that we actually are, where we already have some like belonging and some like consequence, and perhaps some obligation.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I know we're getting toward the end of time. I'm wondering, John, if you want to close with some sort of like an aspiration for the work you're doing with adult initiation and the work that you're doing with younger kids. Like what do you wish for? What's an aspiration for what might be?
Yeah. In my work, like this work I'm doing is driven by my own waking up as a young person to like, wow, the world's really hurting. Like, what are we doing about it? And through all my searching and like activism and trying to make big change on planet Earth, it's like, wow, this piece of rites of passage and like deep human transformation at the individual and cultural level is actually the fundamental building blocks of like the large scale, slow systemic change. And I just want to pray and call in and like bless the like mycelial growth of this culture of really tending transitions and tending the initiations that already happen and tending each other and showing up in cultural service to each other and to the earth and to the constant turns of the wheels and the turn of the wheel of life. Really in a way of beauty, so that we can remember what it is to be a human being together and really bring that culture that just makes life so nourishing and fun and safe and held. That's like my blessing and my prayer.
Yeah, beautiful. Well, thank you so much, John. It was wonderful to hang out and speak with you on this.
Yeah. Thank you, Carl, as well.
Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you enjoy this podcast, it's great if you want to share it with friends or post about it on social media. Also, you could make a donation to support the podcast or find out more information about our classes and offerings at our website, embodimentmatters.com.